Welcome to the Tuesday edition of Juan's World. And as I have been signaling for the past week or so, this is the 400th episode of Juan's World. So I'm going to change gears, and I don't know whether I'm going to change the name, whether I'm going to start counting again, whether I'm going to change the format in any way, the content, I don't know. What I do know is that I'm going to be taking a little break, and in the process I'm going to think about what comes next. This is in part because I want to give it serious consideration, and also because I'm very heavily buried in editing right now, and that needs to take precedence until I can get this manuscript I'm working on off my desk. So let's get started. My topic for episode 400 is round numbers. And there's several ways we can think about round numbers. Like, what is a round number? Typically, in the Euro-American world, we think of tens and multiples of tens, like hundreds and thousands, as round numbers. But they don't have to be. In the Khmer language, counting is done in fives. It's very disconcerting when you first learn the language, and you just start communicating with let's say street vendors or shopkeepers or whatever, and you have to figure out how much something costs. And the way they count is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 plus 1, 5 plus 2, 5 plus 3, 5 plus 4, 10. And then 10 plus 1, 10 plus 2, 10 plus 3, 10 plus 4, 10 plus 5, 10 plus 5 plus 1, and so I know you get used to it, but at the outset you can be a little discommoded by it. The Mayans in pre-colonial times counted in 20s. The Babylonians counted in 60s. We still use that a little bit in like circles, for example, are divided into 360 degrees. Hours are divided up into minutes and seconds, and how many minutes are there in an hour? There are 60. How many seconds in a minute? There are 60. All based on the Babylonian number system based on 60. There's dozens is a very common round number in some parts of the world, not in Asia. It's interesting. Like, if you buy eggs in England or North America, you'll buy them in packs of a dozen. In China, Cambodia, Thailand, wherever, you buy them in packs of 10. And I mean, the mathematicians, kind of and ah about 12, because it's a number that has a lot of factors. You can divide by 2, 3, 4, 6. whereas 10's an awkward one. I mean, yeah, you can divide by 2 and 5, but that's about it. So, like, why do we have an arithmetic system based on 10? Well, the simple answer is we got 10 of these. And so we can count, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, start again. And that's how we end up with round numbers based on 10. And they work in a lot of areas of our lives, like, for example, our ages. I'm not sure whether, I mean, it isn't really the case that your 10th birthday is a particularly important one, and your 20th birthday isn't a very important one either. Back when I was climbing those stairs from 10 to 20, 21 was the most significant birthday. That was the age of majority. That's when you were allowed to vote and a number of other things. But voting was the most important. And you were considered to be a full adult at the age of 21. Well, my generation got stiffed in that respect, because when I turned 19, the government in England, I was living in England at the time, the government in England changed the voting age from 21 to 18. And so the age of majority became 18, and I'd already passed it. So I'd missed the birthday, which has become the most important one in terms of your supposed adulthood, the 18th birthday. I missed that one. And when I got to be 21, a few years later, it had lost its potency. It's a really bad news for me. But so 10 and 20 are not particularly important, and that's interesting to note. But 30 is, and in many cultures 30 is considered to be important for various reasons. Like in most Asian countries, a woman who is over 30 and not married is considered to be over the hill. Like, is not going to ever get married because she's too old. I mean, it does happen, of course, obviously, but they're called by various names in the local language. Basically like forgotten women. That they're not ever going to get married because they passed 30. In Argentina, a woman who turns 30, generally speaking, I mean, it's not something that you can like see, carved into their foreheads or something like that. But a woman who turns 30, even if she's not married, will be addressed differently. Like, until she turns 30, most people will call her señorita. I mean, they may call her señora if she's married, but married or not, when she turns 30, she will be señora. That she's matured to the point of being no longer señorita. And I know a great many women in Buenos Aires who get really, really upset when shopkeepers and people on the street and whatever start calling them señora instead of señorita. That's a big transformation for them. So 30 is a big one. 40 is a big one. Don't know about 50s, I guess kind of, but 60 is a big one. And I turned 70 a few years ago, and that felt like a big one. And I'm thinking that 80 is going to be a really big one. And I kind of hope, I'm going to make it to 90. Those are milestones that we have just arbitrarily decided upon. because every birthday, or every day you're getting older, but somehow or other, like you turn 60, you're saying, okay, I'm now so. And I especially remember turning 70 and thinking, well, that's a big one. That's a huge milestone. But in the grand scheme of things, it's just another day. Um, Now, the part that really amuses me is counting years. And I remember when the New Year's Eve slash day came, when we turned from 1999 to the year 2000. And of course, there were a lot of problems associated with that, including the Y2K problem, which never never materialized. Um, but certain things had to change. Like back in those days, we were still writing checks, and on the top right hand, there was a place to put the date of the check, and there'd be a line and then 19 and a space so that you could write, like 1967, 1968, blah, blah, blah. And they had to take out that 19. Oh, I mean, people don't use checks anymore, so I don't even know what they look like now. I don't have a checkbook. But but that 19 had to disappear because it was no longer relevant in the year 2000. And a lot of people said when the clock ticked over to the year 2000 that we have entered a new century slash new millennium. And a lot of other people said, no, you haven't, because you don't start counting at the year 0. You start counting at the year 1. In other words, like the year 1000 was the end of the first millennium. And the year 2000 was the end of the second millennium. There was no year 0, I mean, like in some sort of theoretical sense, the year that Jesus was born, although that's another complicated issue because he wasn't born in that time period. He could have been born in anywhere between like 4 BCE or 6 CE, which used to be like, in the old way of calculating, we would say BC, which means before Christ. And one calculation has him born in 4 BC. So Christ was born 4 years before he was born. I mean, but anyway, there was no year 0 in between BC and AD or BCE and CE. There's only the year 1 BCE and the year 1 CE, or if you like in the old version, 1 BC, 1 AD. There's no year 0. So if you start with the year 1, then you end the century with the year 100, and you end the millennium with the year 1000. And so the year 2000 was the end of the second millennium, and the year 2001 was the first year of the next millennium. Lots of people went up, down, and sideways about that one, but the thing is that the round number 2000 feels like really important. The year 2001 doesn't feel all that important. My next birthday in March is going to be my 74th birthday. 74. Okay, well, I'm old, but it's not a very important one. 80 is going to be important, and 70 was important, but 74 is, yeah, okay, another birthday. And the quirk here is that when it comes to decades, we do think of the year 1960 or 1970 or 1980 as important new decades, even though we're counting from one onwards. But what matters to us is the first number in the decade. So we can talk about the 60s. Now, when did the 60s? That was the time of hippies and mods and rockers and the Beatles and Rolling Stones and Who and that decade, the 60s. I remember very clearly. I was um, over at my girlfriend's house having dinner and drinks and stuff on New Year's Eve 1969, and everyone, personally and on television and in the media and so forth, was saying, what's going to happen now that the 60s are over and we're coming into the 70s? And we can't say, now wait a minute, the 60s don't end in 69, they end in 71 or like whatever. I mean, that makes no sense. The 70s start with 1970. The 60s start with 1960, and they end with 69 and 79 and so forth. And that's just how we figure the numbers, because of what the first number is in the decade. Not sure. I mean, it's so hard to pin down, like, what were the 60s like, because there were so many different things happening. Like 1961 was just oceans away from 1969. I mean, the music was different, the fashion was different, the way people behaved, the kinds of communities that people formed and so forth. They're all very different. I mean, I can remember back in the 80s and 90s when I was a young professor at one of my at the State University of New York. I can remember some of the students having parties that would be themed based on decades. And one of them I went to was a 1960s themed party. And these are all students who were born, let's see, 80, yeah, some of them were born in the 70s. Some of them were born in the 60s, but like, in other words, they didn't remember the 60s terribly well. And you're asked to come dressed, in typical 60s fashion. And my wife and I went along to this party dressed as hippies. I was actually shaven headed at the time, but I had a big, long wig, and I had a caftan or so. I don't remember exactly, but some kind of hippie dress. All the students came along dressed in in these tight-fitting, Italianate suits, the kind of thing that rockers and pop groups wore in like 1961, 62. The decade just went through numerous changes, so you can't really look at the 60s as a monolith, or the 70s or whatever. I mean, I don't really even pay much attention anymore to what decades symbolize, partly because I moved around so much, so that like people who've lived in the same place all of their lives can more narrowly define decades, because they transform in particular cultural ways that are peculiar to that particular place where they live. So when I think about the 60s, for example, I think about England, because I was living in England in the 60s. The 70s, I think about the United States, because I was living in the United States then. And I don't know anything about the 70s in Britain because I wasn't there. Well, I mean, I was there at the very start, but I moved to the United States. The 80s, United States. 90s United States, and then 2000 onwards, I've been living in all kinds of places. I don't know a lot about what's going on in those places where I used to live, so I can't really define particular decades anymore in terms that make any sense to other people. But they do make a lot of sense to the people who've stayed in one place all their lives. So this sort of round numbers ramble, like how do you treat the decades? How do you treat the decades of your life? How do you think in terms of centuries? I am particularly aware of the change between the 20th century and the 21st century. I remember way back, we're talking about late 50s, early 60s, when there was a television program, what is it called? The Mickey Mouse Club, I guess, and with the Mouseketeers, Jimmy and the Mouseketeers. And it always used to end by saying something, I don't remember the exact words, but it was something like, here's to the current generation, the leaders of the 21st century. Now, way back in 1960, 61 and so forth, 21st century was like way, way, way away. Well, it's here now. And we now talk about the 20th century as, ancient history. I mean, now, where are we, 2025, there's a whole generation of people living in the world who never knew the 20th century. In the same way that I never knew the 19th century. But I knew an awful lot of people who were born in the 19th century. My grandparents were all born in the 19th century. And they made the transition from the 19th to the 20th in much the same way that I've made the transition from the 20th to the 21st. And I'll just leave you with this, question, my 400th episode question. What do these periods mean to you? Are they important or not important? When it comes to ages or centuries or decades, do you care? What happens to you when one of the cycles ends? Like the New Year, we've just had the Gregorian New Year, and we're coming up on the 29th to the Chinese New Year, and we're going to move from the year of the dragon to the year of the snake. What do these transitions mean to you? And meanwhile, I will continue to say, please like and subscribe and tell your friends about my videos, because I will be back. I don't know how long I'm going to be gone, but I will be back, and I will let you know in the various places where I advertise, including Facebook, and have a good week.